Hello class, and welcome to lecture number 7 in Dr. Lewis's course on European history 1500 to the present. Today's lecture will be on the conflict known as World War I, talking about death in the trenches, not just the death of soldiers, but the death of an idealized European society based upon ideas of equality and rationalism. Today's lecture will be exploring a number of themes about global conflict by trying to answer the following 4 questions. Number 1, how did World War I become a global conflict? Number 2, how did Europeans initially react to the outbreak of World War I? Number 3, why did World War I continue on for so long? And number 4, who was it that brought an end to World War I? Since almost all of World War I was fought exclusively on the European continent, many students rightfully so ask the question, why do we refer to it as a world war? The answer that historians have is complicated, but we can identify a number of factors to simplify the issue of why World War I is referred to as a world war, which primarily has to do with the global ramifications of this conflict. First and foremost, once the war started going poorly and Europeans started running low on soldiers who were willing to volunteer, they started bringing in soldiers from their colonies and the territories they had conquered all over the world. One of the main ways that they recruited soldiers from the colonies was the promise that if their side won during this conflict, that the colony would be granted independence once the war was over. A prime example of this is the French colony of French Indochina that we now know as the nation of Vietnam. During World War I, close to 100,000 Vietnamese left their homeland, sailed all the way to Europe to assist France in this war against Germany. Of that 100,000, almost 1/3 died on the battlefield for the French cause. And even though France won World War I, Vietnam was not given independence. We'll see the same phenomenon being repeated during World War II, and eventually the Vietnamese fighting against the French during the 1940s and 50s to gain that independence that had been promised several generations prior. Number 2, World War I helped to facilitate a number of aspects of Japanese expansionism in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. For the fact that Japan was one of Great Britain's closest allies in global politics prior to World War I, Japan played a vital role when this conflict broke out by keeping the German Royal Navy bogged down in the Pacific so that these ships could not assist in the Atlantic with European campaigns. Japan had been promised by Britain an empire throughout Southeast Asia for participating in this war. The problem for Japan in this scenario was the United States, through our British allies, started putting huge pressure upon Japan to stop Japanese expansion. Essentially, Japan fought on the Allied side during World War I, being promised an empire. And when Japan was not given that empire at the end of the conflict, we'll see Japan, like many other nations, on the other side when it comes to World War II, essentially arguing that they'd been betrayed by their allies at the end of this conflict. Perhaps one of the most captivating stories of World War I, in terms of changing dynamics of world events, are the conflicts that the British led in the Middle East at the time what was known as the Ottoman Empire, opening up the era of what historians refer to as the era of oil wars. What helped to trigger and to shape British policy in the Middle East at the outbreak of World War I was that in 1908, a company called the Anglo-Persian Oil Company discovered oil and started drilling in what we now know as the nation of Iran. 2 years after this company started drilling in Iran, oil was discovered in the bordering region of Iraq, which at the time was part of the Ottoman Empire. To try and make sure that the British did not have a monopoly on global petroleum sources, Imperial Germany started working with the Ottoman Empire to develop and to tap into the oil of Iraq, essentially to have a balance of powers when it came to petroleum extraction in the Middle East. Throughout World War I, then, we see the British primarily focusing much of their efforts on trying to destroy the Ottoman Empire and trying to encourage independence revolts throughout the Middle East, not because the British cared per se about the independence of Arab peoples, but because the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which we now know in modern times as British Petroleum, wanted to control the oil resources of Iran and Iraq. Once this war was over, not only had there been a number of unsettling global factors during this war, but the world we see created at the end of World War I is an incredibly unstable world order that essentially lays the basis for World War II. One of the great challenges that historians face when analyzing the complex phenomenon of diplomacy in 1914 is asking the question, was Germany postured in an aggressive stance against the international community at the outbreak of World War I, or in a defensive stance against an international community that Germans considered were gaining up upon the German Empire? To understand the complexity of 1914, we need to back up several decades to understand the development of diplomacy at the end of the 19th century. In the year 1871, when Germany became a formal united nation under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck, Bismarck made sure that Germany had a strong position based upon its geography. Otto von Bismarck's greatest fear was what many Germans referred to as a nightmare war. Since Germany was smack dab in the center of Europe, many Germans feared the idea of Germany someday being surrounded by enemies on all sides and perhaps having to fight a war on two fronts, which is a war in many Germans' minds was one that Germany was guaranteed to lose. To make sure that this never happened under his leadership, Otto von Bismarck made sure that France never had any allies with other European powers. The great problem for Germany then is in the year 1890, Kaiser Wilhelm II fired Otto von Bismarck from his job as German Chancellor, allowing France now to reach out to Germany's traditional ally, Russia, and to form an alliance. Starting in the year 1891, just after Kaiser Wilhelm II had come to power, Germany was now hypothetically surrounded by enemies on all sides on the European continent. To make matters worse, in the year 1896, the British and the Americans set aside 150 years of hatred and tensions, and for the first time in modern history, became friends and allies. When you combine these two powers together with the strength of the British Royal Navy and the strength of the American Navy, particularly under the leadership of Teddy Roosevelt, these two powers combined controlled the oceans of the world, Germany now believing that there was an aggressive threat against Germany when it came to the high seas. In 1904, Britain and France also stunned historians and diplomats by putting aside almost 1,500 years of hatred and tension and signing the Entente Cordiale, Britain and France saying that even though that traditionally they hated each other, they now believed that Germany was a threat against both of these nations. To make matters worse, in 1907, Britain reached out to Russia, now creating a three-way alliance between Britain, France, and Russia in European politics. To make this scenario dangerous, though, unintentionally dangerous, Russia reached out to the small East European nation of Serbia and signed a formal alliance in the year 1908. What this now meant is that if Serbia got into any trouble in international relations, that Russia would be dedicated to come to Serbia's aid. If Russia came to Serbia's aid, this also meant that Britain and France could hypothetically be dragged into a war. If Britain and France were dragged into a war, the United States might become part of the conflict as well. To offset this dangerous international scenario, Germany set up an alliance throughout Central Europe and Southeast Europe between Germany, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, in what we now know as the modern nation of Turkey. Germans also tried to come up with a military strategy to make sure that Germany would survive and potentially win a war if a European conflict ever broke out. The German general von Schlieffen came up with a plan based upon the idea that Germany could utilize its central position in the European continent and the fact that Russia had the worst railway system in all of Europe to strategically knock France out and Germany out if any war broke out. The von Schlieffen plan called for German forces to be stationed upon the Western Front and over a 2-week period to invade Belgium and to circle around here and to knock Paris out and knock France out of any war in the first 2 weeks of a conflict. What Germany then planned upon doing was taking their soldiers and utilizing the fact that they had the best train system in all of Europe, ship their soldiers who were no longer necessary in the Western Front across Germany to the Eastern Front, and to knock Russia out of the war before Russia even had a chance to fully mobilize its army, essentially depending upon the fact that Germany had the best train system and Russia had the worst. The great problem for Germany in this scenario then was that after France and Russia signed this alliance in the year 1891, French industrialists started investing in the creation of a new railway system in Russia that was supposed to be completed during the summer of 1915. This meant that if European conflict did not break out in 1914 and that peace continued on to 1915, that the von Schlieffen Plan would not be able to work in the future. So the question being, in 1914, is Germany lashing out as an aggressive force, or was Germany felt pinned in on all sides, and that war became an inevitable factor when it came to German international relations? On June 28, 1914, in the Bosnian capital of Sarajevo, an act of terrorism occurred. A terrorist organization based out of Serbia called the Serbian Black Hand assassinated the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was heir to the Austrian throne. This act of terrorism caused an international diplomatic crisis between Austria and between Serbia. Austria demanded that Serbia arrest all of the members of the Black Hand and hand them over to Serbia to be put on trial for murder in the Austrian capital of Vienna. The problem for Serbia in this scenario is that while Serbia was willing to assist Austria in investigations, Serbia did not have an extradition treaty with Austria, which meant that legally, according to international law and practice, Serbia could not move these criminals across international borders. On July 25, 1914, Austria gave Serbia a 48-hour ultimatum, either saying hand over all of the members of the Black Hand, or that Austria would declare war upon Serbia. If Austria declared war upon Serbia, this would surely bring Russia into the conflict and cause the outbreak of a global war. On August 1, 1914, believing that they had no other choice, German leaders declared war upon Russia in a preemptive strike, hoping that Britain and France would not be crazy enough to come through on the wartime alliances. The problem in this scenario is that European public came out in huge support of this conflict because politicians either naively believed or blatantly lied to the European populations, stating that the troops would be back home by Christmas and that surely their side was guaranteed victory in this conflict. On August 4th, Britain and France, much to the dismay of Russia, came through on their alliances and World War I began. The problem in this scenario is that the German von Schlieffen Plan, while it looked good on paper, once it was put into motion in reality, plans didn't match up. The von Schlieffen Plan depended upon the Russians mobilizing very slowly, and that once they were put out on the battlefield, that the British and French commanders would despise each other instead of coordinating with each other. Both factors ended up not being true, and by September of 1914, the von Schlieffen Plan had failed, and World War I now became a war of attrition on the Western Front, with Allied powers digging in for a prolonged trench warfare. What also occurred was the Socialist International, who now for generations had made peace pledges and argued that if war ever broke out, that socialists would lead workers out on a general strike, bringing an immediate end to the war. Socialist parties throughout Europe, including the British Labour Party and the German Social Democratic Party, instead of coming through on their pledges to young people to make sure that World War I did not continue, they instead came out in defense of their nation and supported the war effort. The one main group in the Socialist International that took a different stance was the group of revolutionaries from Russia led by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, people who were referred to at the time as Bolsheviks or communists. What Lenin's group within the Second International argued was that European leaders had just inadvertently dug their own grave, that the soldiers of World War I were the workers of the world, and that the workers of the world had now been handed a gun by the rulers of the world, and that as time went on, that the war would radicalize soldiers, and that the entire conflict would end in a full-fledged socialist revolution of soldiers turning their guns upon their officers and upon their political leaders. Now the great challenge then is, once this war broke out, was the question, can this war be stopped? Or is it going to take on a life of its own and momentum of its own, making it nearly an impossible juggernaut for Europeans to control? By the late fall of 1914, it became obvious to European public and Western Europe that this war was going to be very different than the one they had initially supported. Number one, this wasn't going to be a short war, but a prolonged war that required total war mobilization. What this meant on the home front was the increase of taxes and the shifting over in industry from the production of consumer goods, now industry exclusively building products for the war. What this meant for soldiers on the battlefield was that they would not be home to share with their loved ones Christmas in 1914. If you read stories about Christmas Eve in 1914 on the Western Front, they're heartbreaking but also quite touching stories, where soldiers attest that on Christmas Eve, they started hearing songs coming from the trenches of the opposing sides. That they didn't recognize the words, but they recognized the tunes as their Christmas carols. Much to the annoyance of their officers, soldiers on the Western Front decided to take matters into their own hands, declare an unofficial truce on Christmas of 1914, and to go out into no man's land, with the opposing sides in this conflict celebrating Christmas with each other. The great problem with this is in order for a war to actually work and for soldiers to be willing to kill, soldiers need to believe that the opponents on the other side are somehow their enemy and somehow evil, different. After spending Christmas Eve drinking with each other, singing Christmas carols, it was very difficult on both sides to get these soldiers to actually fight against each other over the upcoming weeks, because not only did they now think about the opposing sides as not evil, they thought about them as drinking buddies, as fellow Christians. We'll see then, Christmas in 1914, celebrating the birth of the Prince of Peace, became far too dangerous, and that for the rest of this war, soldiers were no longer allowed to celebrate Christmas. The great problem and challenge with World War I then is coming up to World War I, European powers had gone through the Industrial Revolution, had new technologies, but the powers they had gone to war with were from Asia and Africa, peoples that did not have these new technologies, which meant the wars were always short, and the Europeans always won with very few casualties. Now when you have modern industrial powers going to war with other modern industrial powers, it turned into what we call a war of attrition. Essentially the idea being to inflict as much pain and suffering upon your opponent that eventually you hope that they'll surrender. What this means for soldiers then is soldiers running across a territory between trenches referred to as no man's land, where you'd have tens of thousands of young men at a time running straight towards a machine gunner. While technology had taken huge leaps coming up to World War I, we'll see psychology had not. Soldiers who had prolonged tours of duty on the Western Front started developing the phenomenon of what we call shell shock at the time, and now in modern times we call PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. That the human mind is not capable of functioning prolonged periods in such reality. Very quickly, by December of 1914, Europeans started to identify that the war was spiraling out of control, and now that this war, essentially now that Pandora's box had been opened, was it even possible for it to be closed? Although Russia was part of the Allied coalitions of both World War I and World War II, in both conflicts, Russia had a very different experience than the Western Allied powers. Number one, if you remember our lectures several weeks ago about Napoleon Bonaparte, we had said that Napoleon conquered the entirety of the European continent, except for Russia. The great problem and challenge with this is when Napoleon conquered Europe, he brought new ideas about merit-based promotion, particularly when it came to the military. For the fact that Russia had never been conquered by Napoleon, the Russian military had not adopted Napoleonic practices, which meant that the generals of Russia were aristocrats who were not talented in their positions, but who had simply been born into these positions of power and leadership, which meant coming into World War I, Russia, hands down, had the worst military leadership in all of Europe. Number two is the rest of Europe had gone through the Industrial Revolution. Russia had done very little leading up to 1914 to industrialize, and out of the great powers of Europe was the least industrialized power in all of Europe, who were now facing off against Germany, who was not just the industrial juggernaut of Europe, but was the most highly industrialized nation in the entire world. In 1914, the Russian Tsar took a gamble because he realized he did not have enough supplies for 1915, hoping that his troops would be back home by Christmas of 1914. In the year 1915, it started becoming incredibly common for soldiers to be sent up to the front lines to fight against the Germans without guns, being told that there would be guns waiting for them when they got to the front. This was not true. In the year 1915 alone, the Russian military is going to lose 2.5 million soldiers, either to death, to wounds, or as prisoners of war. Based upon these great shortages and the increasing brutality of this war, the Russian Tsar, who had traditionally been known as the Little Father, the protector of the Russian people, now started being perceived of as an oppressor of the Russian people. Due to the starvation and dying and suffering that occurred on the Eastern Front, we'll see in the opening months of 1917 the Russian people rising up and overthrowing the Tsar. By the end of the year, due to the suffering the Tsar had inflicted upon the Russian people, many Russian people calling for the Tsar's execution as not a protector of the Russian people, but as a murderer of the Russian people. The years 1915 and 1916 were incredibly complex in the European conflicts of World War I, but there are two major dynamics that defined public opinion when it came to this conflict during these wars that historians are able to look back and analyze to understand something about the eventual outcomes we have with World War I. Number one of the great controversies of full war mobilization is that outside of socialist economies, most capitalist nations, when it comes to production for World War I, turned to private industry with government contracts to produce goods for the military. What this meant in economies of Western Europe was that domestic production was booming. There was a huge number of jobs, but these jobs were almost exclusively producing products for the military. What it also meant was the United States continued on with its stance of neutrality because as a neutral nation, American private industry could supply war materials to both sides, essentially making money off from both sides when it came to this global conflict. More and more, people started asking the question, number one, why were the troops not home by Christmas of 1914? And number two, asking, is this war getting prolonged because private corporations were profiteering and getting rich off the suffering of humanity? These perceptions about wartime profiteering and critiques of the dynamics of World War I started manifesting in the streets of the British Empire. In the Scottish city of Glasgow, a young woman named Mary Barber, who had spent her life working in the shipyards of Glasgow, started leading protests in the streets, beating up cops with pots and pans, protesting the phenomenon of war profiteering. In Easter of 1916, in the Irish capital of Dublin, a young revolutionary by the name of James Connolly argued that the Irish would no longer fight for the king, they would not side with the Kaiser, but that the Irish people were going to rise up against all warmongers and declare their independence. As the war continued on then, things started heating up on the home front, not just for the British, but for all sides in this conflict. In 1916, also, to facilitate greater economic expansion, President Wilson of the United States ran for re-election on a peace platform, arguing to the American people that European conflicts were not something that Americans were ever going to participate in, and that if he was re-elected to office in 1916, they had assured the American people that American soldiers would never go to Europe. Here's the great problem, 1915 and 1916. Is that in the spring of these years, the Allied forces primarily would go on the offensive, trying to break through enemy lines with huge numbers of troops. The problem is, these tens of thousands of troops are running across no man's land, as we identified in our previous slide, running straight towards machine gunners, which meant in the springtime, Allied casualties were always far greater than the casualties of the Central Powers. The other great challenge is usually during midsummer, Germany and the other Central Powers would reconfigure themselves, launch counteroffensives, and by the time fall came around, after hundreds of thousands of young men had died and lost their lives, essentially every fall a reset button was hit on the Western Front, where neither side had won any territory and neither side had lost any territory, and that the troops wouldn't be home by Christmas of 1915 or 1916. By the end of 1916, Europeans started getting desperate, asking the question, who is going to bring an end to this war, and can this war be brought to an end? Prior to World War I, Vladimir Lenin and his Russian Communist movement had been virtual unknowns in international politics. By the end of the year 1917, though, Vladimir Lenin became one of the most well-known, one of the most well-respected, for some, and for others, most feared and powerful politicians in the entire world. What helped to trigger Vladimir Lenin's rise to power in 1917 was on March 8, 1917, Alexander Kerensky, a young lawyer from Moscow, overthrew the Tsar's government and instituted Russia to be a democratic republic. The problem for Alexander Kerensky, then, is that democratic republics need stability, and that the Russian people were suffering greatly, and that people who are suffering, they don't care about equality, they don't care about a right to vote, they care about bringing an end to the death and the suffering. And the great question then for Alexander Kerensky is, even though the Russian people no longer wanted to be part of this war, should his government fulfill the obligations of the Tsar's government and continue on in this conflict? On April 16, 1917, the French decided to take matters into their own hand when it came to this conflict, reacting to the fact that just 2 weeks prior to this, President Wilson broke his peace pledge to the American public and declared war upon Germany. France argued that the French really didn't need American help, and that over a 48-hour period, using the correct strategies, the French High Command argued that they could knock Germany out of this war in 48 hours, leading France to a triumph in World War I. The naval offensive had been designed with the idea that France, over a 48-hour period, using the correct techniques, would lose about 40,000 soldiers, but that Germany could be knocked out of the war. The problem for France in this scenario is that April of 1917 was one of the rainiest springs that Europe had ever known in all of its history, which meant places like no man's land, where you'd been dropping artillery shells now for several years with huge craters. You add in extra water and mud, no man's land became a death trap. The naval offensive, instead of costing France 40,000 troops over a 48-hour period, led to 515,000 casualties combined over just several days. Instead of continuing on with this effort, approximately 40,000 French troops rose up in mutiny, starting to kill their officers and threatening a complete revolution in France if the war continued. To try and take pressure off from the Western Front, Alexander Kerensky naively and foolishly launched an offensive on the Eastern Front on June 18, 1917. Over a week-and-a-half period, the Russian army lost 400,000 men, inflicting even more suffering upon the Russian people. It's at this point that Vladimir Lenin came forward with a simple proposal and a simple slogan for the Russian people. The communists started campaigning against the Kerensky government under the slogan, "Land, Bread, and Peace." July 31, 1917. The British, to take pressure off from the Eastern Front, went on the offensive in the small Belgian town of Ypres. The Third Battle of Ypres. This wasn't a battle that only lasted for a couple weeks. It was a prolonged battle that lasted for several months. But no man's land had literally become a death trap. During this time, the British didn't lose 40,000 troops total. They literally lost 40,000 troops in the mud of no man's land, their bodies never being recovered, never found again. To bring an end to this madness, on November 7, 1917, Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks rose up, toppled the Kerensky government, and instituted a new Soviet government in Russia, renaming Russia no longer the Russian Empire, but the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, also known as the USSR or the Soviet Union. Lenin's pledge to the Russian people was, despite pressures from the Western Allies, that Russia would now sign a separate peace with Germany and bring an immediate end to World War I. Despite mass opposition from the leadership of the Allied powers, Vladimir Lenin, under the organizing leadership of Leon Trotsky, signed a separate peace with the German Empire on March 8, 1918, with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Once the Russians signed this separate peace, it meant that the German High Command no longer needed to worry about a war on two fronts, could take all German troops from the Eastern Front, move them over to the Western Front, and hoped that during the summer of 1918, Germany could knock the British and the French out of power before more American troops could arrive for this European conflict. On March 21, 1918, the Germans launched the largest offensive in all of World War I, known as the Ludendorff Offensive, for the leadership of General Ludendorff. Initially, the Germans were incredibly successful and made it almost all the way to Paris. The problem is, American reinforcements started arriving by the millions in April of 1918, reorganized with fresh leadership and soldiers that weren't suffering from shell shock, and launched a counteroffensive during the summer, with essentially German forces being driven back by August of 1918. What this triggered was two different revolutions in German politics in October of 1918, one being what I'd call a revolution from above, the other being a revolution from below. On October 3, 1918, the German Chancellor was thrown out of power, and a new Chancellor was brought into command of the German Empire named Prince Max von Baden. What von Baden did immediately upon coming to power was sat down with General Hindenburg and General Ludendorff to ask, can Germany win this war? These two generals argued that too much suffering had been inflicted upon the German people, that German troop morale would no longer support this war, and that Germany needed to contact the Americans immediately to sit down and negotiate a peace. What Prince Max von Baden did was he immediately contacted President Wilson of the United States and said that Germany was willing to talk about a peace deal, but that the negotiations needed to be kept secret. What President Wilson did is, instead of keeping this promise for secret negotiations, is he immediately leaked the story to the press, which meant over the next couple of weeks, headlines started appearing in American newspapers and European newspapers that the war was about to come to an end. Which meant if you were a soldier who had survived all the way up to 1918, and you think the war is going to end any day now, why on earth would you fight anymore? And this is exactly what President Wilson hoped when he leaked this story to the press. On October 29, 1918, German sailors at the port city of Kiel were told to go on the attack against the British Royal Navy. German sailors realized that they were outnumbered 3-1, and that essentially this would be a suicide mission. Instead of following these suicidal orders, German sailors instead shot all of their officers there at the port, raised the Soviet flag over German ships, and declared that they would no longer fight. Story of the Kiel Mutiny quickly spread throughout Europe, and essentially soldiers either A, shot their officers, or B, laid down their guns and said, no more. The German Kaiser, fearing of what had just occurred in Russia with the creation of the Soviet Union, feared that such a revolution may also occur in Germany, so on November 9, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated from the throne and fled to the neighboring nation of Belgium. This now meant that Germany was a republic, and that soldiers would no longer fight. So on November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m. in the morning, the guns fell silent on the Western Front, officially bringing an end to World War I. The problem is nobody was fully prepared for peace to come, as the peace sort of came out of the blue because soldiers had said, no more. Politicians, when they sit down and they sign the Treaty of Versailles, that we'll talk about a little bit in our next lecture, they didn't set up a world that would sustain the peace. They set up a very unjust and punitive peace treaty that essentially laid the basis for World War II on the same day that World War I came to an end. And we'll explore these themes in our next lecture on the rise of communism and fascism in 1920s and 1930s Europe.